The frost came down hard on Ardnaglass that November, the kind of frost that makes the air taste like a coin held under your tongue. And it was into this stillness that Annie Bythe went out at 6:30 in the morning to walk her dog, and found that the birds had stopped singing. She didn't know that was what had happened, not at first. She only knew something was wrong the way you know a room is wrong when a clock stopped ticking in it. Not from anything you can point to, just from an absence pressing on your ears. She stood at the fence of Corey House with her wee terrier straining at the lead, and she thought, "It's too quiet." And then she looked properly at the byre and saw Fenella Strachan lying on the straw-covered floor between the cages, on her back, her cardigan buttoned wrong, one slipper on and one slipper off, quite dead. By the time the Ardnaglass constable arrived, and it was, of course, Hamish Macbeth, unbuttoning his jacket against the cold because he never could be bothered doing it up properly in the first place, the doctor from Brakey had already pronounced what anybody with eyes could see, that Fenella had been struck once, hard, across the back of the skull, likely with something round and heavy, and had not suffered long. Hamish stood in the doorway of the byre with his hands in his pockets, and did not, for a good long while, look at the body at all. He looked at the birds, 40 cages, and not one sound out of any of them. Not the finches, who by rights ought to have been kicking up a racket at the disturbance, the strange men, the cold draught through the open door. Not the curlews, who Fenella herself had told him once could set your teeth on edge with their crying if you came too near feeding time. Not even the young golden eagle, recovering from a broken wing after a run-in with a wind turbine blade, who usually screeched blue murder if a stranger's shadow crossed its cage. 40 birds sat huddled and silent in the corners of their cages like they'd all, every one of them, seen the same ghost. "Well now," Hamish said to nobody in particular, "that's queer." The Strathbane detectives, when they came, a Detective Inspector Blair, red-faced and impatient even in the cold, with a sergeant trailing after him taking notes, were far more interested in the birdbath, because there, frozen half into a lump of grey ice, was a coil of magnetic tape, the old reel-to-reel kind, the sort Fenella used for her famous recordings. Someone had clearly tried to burn it or dissolve it, and failing that, had simply flung it into the water to freeze. "Evidence tampering," Blair said with satisfaction, as if he'd solved the whole thing already. "Somebody didn't want us hearing what was on that tape." And then there was the scarecrow, an ordinary straw man Fenella kept in her vegetable patch to scare off the crows that liked to raid her seed stores, except that around its neck, tied with a single strand of red wool like a tiny noose, was a small brass bell, the kind you'd clip round an injured bird's leg to identify it once it was released back to the wild. Hamish crouched by the eagle's cage a long moment and saw the pale mark on its leg where such a bell should have been, and was not. 3 strange things, in a byre gone silent as a held breath, around the body of a woman the whole village called a saint. Hamish Macbeth had a way of looking half asleep even when his mind was going round like a mill wheel, and this had fooled cleverer men than Blair over the years, which Hamish considered no great achievement, Blair not being awfully clever to begin with. He let the Strathbane lot fuss over the tape, and photograph the birdbath from 6 angles, and dust the scarecrow for prints that would never be there, because straw doesn't hold a print worth a docken. And instead he wandered back into the byre and crouched down by the nearest cage, a little pair of chaffinches, and made a soft clicking noise with his tongue the way he did with his own hens. Nothing, not a flutter. "Now that's no natural," he said to Sergeant McGregor, who'd come up from the Brakey station to help with the door-to-doors. "A bird startles, aye, it goes quiet a minute, maybe flies about a bit daft, but 40 birds all struck dumb the one morning and no a peep out of any of them since? That's no fright, that's something else. Maybe the cold, Hamish. It's no been that cold before now." Hamish stood, unfolding himself slowly, and looked at Blair crouched over the birdbath with a pair of tweezers like he was performing surgery on the ice. "Inspector'll be wanting yon tape sent to a lab in Inverness, I expect," Take them a fortnight, and you'll be wanting to sit on your hands the meantime, I suppose," Blair said without looking up. "Oh, I expect I'll potter about," Hamish said mildly, and went to have another look at the golden eagle. It was the missing bell that snagged at him, the way a loose thread snags at a jumper, and you can't help but pull it even knowing it'll unravel the whole sleeve. Everybody in the byre was talking about the tape, what was on it, who'd tried to destroy it, what secrets it might hold, because a tape was a thing you could imagine being full of scandal, and scandal was interesting. Nobody but Hamish seemed much bothered about a wee brass bell moved from a bird's leg to a scarecrow's neck. He went and had a word with the eagle itself, if you could call it that, crouching by the cage with his big hands loose between his knees, the way he'd sit with a nervous dog. The bird watched him with one flat gold eye and said nothing, same as it had said nothing to everyone else that morning. But Hamish thought, and he'd have been embarrassed to say this out loud to Blair, that there was something almost apologetic in the way it held itself, hunched small in the corner of a cage far too big for its silence. "You saw something," he murmured, "or heard it, mare-like. Birds don't think much of what they see. It's the hearing does it." He was aware, standing there, that he was the only man in the byre not looking at the tape, and that this would be remarked upon later. Blair liked nothing better than a story about Constable Macbeth wasting police time talking to poultry, but Hamish had learned a long while back that the loud clue in a case was near always a distraction dressed up bonny, and the quiet clue was the one that actually mattered. Somebody had wanted that eagle silenced, specifically, deliberately, and had taken its bell to do something else with it entirely. That was a decision made under pressure, in a hurry, by somebody who knew birds well enough to catch a wing-broken eagle without losing a finger. That narrowed the field considerable. In a village where near everybody kept hens, but hardly a soul kept anything wilder. By afternoon the village had assembled itself, as villages do, into a rough circle of the concerned and the curious, and Hamish went among them with a notebook he rarely wrote in and an expression of polite, sleepy interest that made people forget he was listening at all. There was Roddy Sinclair, who ran the village shop and had supplied Fenella her seed and suet for 11 years, and who could not stop wringing a tea towel in his hands the whole time Hamish spoke to him, though Hamish put this down, at first, to grief, until he noticed Roddy's eyes kept sliding toward the till behind him, as though he were doing sums in his head that had nothing to do with birdseed. There was Dr. Isla Farquhar, the young GP who'd taken over the practice 2 years back, and who spoke of Fenella with a careful, measured warmth that struck Hamish as the tone of somebody choosing every word the way you'd cross a river on stepping stones, testing each one before putting weight on it. There was old Fergus Tolmie, the retired lighthouse keeper, who lived alone on the point and had, by his own cheerful account, no time for the woman and her racket of birds, a directness that Hamish rather liked, because an honest dislike was easier to work with than a performed grief, though he noted that Fergus's hands, when he lit his pipe, were not quite steady. And there was Morag Keswick, the schoolteacher, a quiet, careful woman of perhaps 45, who taught the village's dozen children their sums and their spelling in the single classroom by the kirk, and who had been, by all accounts, closer to Fenella than most. The two women often seen walking the shore road together of an evening, or sharing a pot of tea in Fenella's kitchen while the birds called from the byre. Morag's face, when Hamish spoke to her, was very still and very pale, and she answered his questions in short, correct sentences, like a pupil reciting a lesson she'd learned too well. "You were close to Mrs. Strachan," Hamish said. "I was. Walked with her often, I hear. Often enough. When did you last see her?" A pause, very slight. "Sunday evening. We had tea." Hamish nodded slowly and said nothing further on it, though he noted that Sunday evening was 2 full days before the death, which seemed a long gap for two women who were supposedly such close friends, in a village small enough that most folk saw each other daily whether they meant to or no. He noted, too, that Morag's son, a lad of 16 called Ewan, who ought by rights to have been the pride of her life, quiet, clever, top of his class at the Breaky Academy, was nowhere in the circle of villagers that afternoon, and when Hamish asked after him, Morag's still face went stiller yet, and she said only that Ewan was away at his studies, and did not meet Hamish's eye when she said it. Each of them, Hamish thought, walking home in the blue dusk with his dog Bran trotting at his heel, was carrying some private weight that had nothing directly to do with murder and everything to do with the ordinary shabby business of being human. Debts, fears, small shames, and any one of those weights, pressed on hard enough by the right hand, might tip a person toward something they'd never have believed themselves capable of. The trick, as ever, would be working out which weight had been pressed, and by whom, and how very hard. Detective Inspector Blair gathered what he called his working theory by Thursday afternoon and delivered it to Hamish in the lay-by outside the Ardnaglass shop with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has, once again, outthought the slow country constable. "It's the shopkeeper," Blair said, around a mouthful of the pie he'd bought inside. "Sinclair, man's up to his eyes in debt. I had the bank manager in Brakey confirm it, quiet-like. Strachan woman lent him money 2 years back to keep the shop afloat, and lately she's been asking for it returned, with interest, and Sinclair hasn't got it. Man's about to lose the shop his father built. That's motive enough for me. And the tape, sir? The bell? Red herrings, Macbeth, or else the fella's covering his tracks with a bit of theatre. Folk do that, you know, dress a simple thing up, complicated so it looks cleverer than it is. My money's on Sinclair losing his temper over a demand for payment, striking her without thinking, then panicking and making a mess of the scene after, trying to look clever." Blair wiped his mouth. Motive, opportunity, and a man wringing his hands like Lady Macbeth every time you look at him. Case closes itself. It was, Hamish reflected, watching Blair drive off toward Brakey in a spray of gravel. A perfectly reasonable theory, built on real facts, arranged in a sensible order, and it had the single fatal flaw of explaining everything except the 3 things that actually mattered. Roddy Sinclair's debt explained motive for a man who lost his temper. It explained nothing about why 40 birds sat silent in their cages, unless Roddy Sinclair had some secret gift for terrifying poultry into a 2-day silence, which Hamish, who'd known Roddy since they were boys catching sticklebacks in the same burn, thought unlikely in the extreme. It explained nothing about a reel of tape deliberately half destroyed and then abandoned, unless Roddy had reason to fear something recorded on it, and so far as anyone knew, Roddy Sinclair had never so much as been in Fenella's buyer. His business with her conducted entirely over the counter of his shop, or, latterly, in stiff conversations about repayment schedules, and it explained nothing at all about a bell moved from an eagle's leg to a scarecrow's neck, tied with a strand of red wool like a tiny noose, a detail so peculiar, so specific, that Hamish could not for the life of him fit it to a shopkeeper's panic over an unpaid loan. He said none of this to Blair, because saying it would only earn him a lecture on knowing his place, and instead went back to Corrie House that evening, let himself in with the key still hanging on its hook by the back door where Fenella had always kept it for the vet, and sat a long while in the silent byre listening to 40 birds say nothing at all, turning over in his mind the shape of a crime that seemed built, quite deliberately, to look like several entirely different, simpler crimes at once. A tidy, obvious answer, he thought, dressed up to stop a body looking any further. And the trouble with tidy, obvious answers, in Hamish's long experience of the Highlands and its grudges, was that they were nearly always wrong, and nearly always put together by somebody a good deal cleverer than the tidy, obvious suspect they pointed toward. Hamish took Roddy Sinclair a cup of tea in the back room of the shop, mostly to watch his hands, and found that under the plain fact of the man's debt lay a plainer fact still. Roddy had spent the Tuesday morning of the murder loading the delivery van for the Ullapool run, in full view of his own wife and the postie, a good 3 miles from Corrie House by the time anybody placed Fenella's death. "I'll no pretend I liked owing her money," Roddy said, turning his mug round and round on the table without drinking from it. "But I'd sooner have gone bankrupt honest than laid a finger on the woman. She wasnae cruel about it, Hamish, whatever Blair's telt you. She gave me time. It was me that was ashamed, no her that was hard. This chimed oddly, Hamish thought, with the picture Blair had painted of a moneylender squeezing a desperate man, and it chimed oddly, too, with something Hamish had noticed and filed away without quite knowing why. That Fenella Strachan, a woman living alone on what should have been a modest income from birdsong recordings, had in the past 2 years quietly paid off the roof of the kirk, funded new books for Morag's classroom, and lent money, interest-light or interest-free by every account Hamish could gather, to at least 3 other households in the village whose names came up shyly, sideways, in conversation. A saint, the village called her. A woman of quiet, generous means, whose income from birdsong Hamish had always vaguely assumed was greater than it looked. It was Dr. Farquhar who let slip the crack in this picture, and she let it slip the way careful people always do, not through what she said, but through the shape of what she left unsaid. She was a complicated woman, Fenella, the doctor said, standing in her surgery doorway, with her arms folded against the cold, choosing her words the way she'd chosen them at their first meeting, testing each stone before her weight went on it. Generous, aye. But generosity, Hamish. She stopped. Aye? Generosity's no always simple. That's all I'll say. Hamish did not push her that afternoon, because pushing a careful woman only makes her more careful. But he walked back down the shore road, turning that sentence over like a stone in his pocket, and by the time he reached his own house he had begun, very quietly, to wonder whether the money flowing so gently from Fenella Strachan into the pockets of Ardnaglass had ever, truly, been given, or whether some of it, at least, had been the price of something else entirely, a payment extracted rather than a gift bestowed, and dressed up so prettily as charity that the whole village had mistaken the shape of it. He thought of Morag Kessock's still, correct face, and the 2-day gap in a friendship that walked the shore road together most evenings, and the son who was away at his studies and would not be looked at directly when his mother spoke of him, and he thought that here, perhaps, was the first true crack in the smooth, saintly surface everyone in Ardnaglass had built around Fenella Strachan without ever quite meaning to. The tape came back from the lab in Inverness on the Monday, a full week after the murder, and it very nearly handed Blair his case gift-wrapped. It was not blank, as the freezing and the half-melting might have suggested. A skilled technician had recovered enough of the magnetic surface to play back some 40 minutes of recording, and what it held was not birdsong at all, but a conversation, recorded from somewhere close and hidden, between Fenella Strachan and Roddy Sinclair, in which Roddy could quite clearly be heard saying, in a voice thick with strain, "I could kill you for this, Fenella. I mean it. I could kill you," followed by the sound of a chair scraping and a door banging shut. Blair was delighted. "There's your motive, Macbeth," recorded in the man's own voice. But Hamish, listening to the tape a second time in the quiet of the Brikey station, found himself troubled by exactly how clean it was. The recording began precisely at the moment the threat was spoken, with no lead-in, no context, no ordinary rustle of a conversation building toward anger, as though someone had known exactly which 40 seconds to preserve and had cut away everything either side of it. And the tape itself had been found half-melted in a bird bath, in a manner that drew every eye toward it, rather than simply destroyed, or hidden, or left where it might never be found at all. "It's too clean, sir," Hamish said carefully. "It's evidence, Constable. That's what it is." "Aye, but think on it. If somebody genuinely wanted rid of a recording, they'd burn it, or bin it in Inverness where nobody would ever find it. They would nae leave it half in a bird bath outside the very byre where the body was found, melted just enough to be noticed, no enough to be lost. That's no destruction. That's presentation." Blair, who did not care for having his gift-wrapped case questioned, told Hamish rather sharply to leave the theorizing to those paid to do it, and took the tape as confirmation that Roddy Sinclair would shortly be under arrest. But Hamish went to see Roddy again that evening, and Roddy, white-faced and shaking, did not deny the words on the tape at all. "Aye, I said that. Months back. Mind, no, the week she died. I said it in temper, when she first told me the terms of paying her back, and I've regretted the words every day since, because folk say things in anger they'd never in life act on, and now here's a tape making it sound as if I said it the very morning she died. Do you ken who might have been recording ye?" Roddy's face did something complicated, fear, and something under the fear that looked almost like relief at finally being asked the right question. "She recorded everybody, Hamish. That's what I've come to think this past week, turning it over at night when I canna sleep for dread of the police coming for me. All they wee microphones about the place, hid in the hedges, in the trees, for the bird song," she said. "But I'm no say sure now it was only birds she was after catching." Hamish spent the better part of 2 days after that asking questions that sounded, to anybody listening, like the idle chat of a man with nothing better to do. What time did the postie usually come by Corrie House? Did Fenella take milk in her tea or no? Had anybody ever helped her change the recording reels in her hidden microphones? Did she keep a diary, a calendar, an address book? And where might such things be found now? It was Mrs. Baird who did for Fenella twice a week, cleaning and tidying, who let him into the cottage itself and showed him, without being asked twice, the small locked cabinet in the study that Fenella had always kept the key to on a chain round her own neck, a key that had gone missing from the body, the Strathbane lot having found no key at all in her cardigan pockets when they searched her. "I never had cause to look in it," Mrs. Baird said. She was that private about her recordings, said the equipment was delicate and no to be touched. I thought nothing of it. You dinna think ill of a woman for keeping her hobby tidy. The cabinet, when Hamish finally got a locksmith out from Brakey to open it under proper warrant, held not birdsong equipment at all, but reel after reel of tape, each carefully labeled not with a bird species or a date of recording, but with a single name: R. Sinclair, I. Farquhar, F. Ptolemy, M. Kessock. 4 names, 4 households, 4 sets of recordings taken. Hamish now understood with a cold settling feeling in his stomach, not from hedgerows and treetops at all, but from hidden microphones planted somewhere in or near each of those 4 homes. He thought of the pattern of Fenella's generosity across the village, the shop debt half forgiven, the school books funded, the kirk roof mended, and wondered, with a growing unease, whether these gifts had in fact been the visible half of a much less charitable arrangement. Money given quietly in one hand, while in the other, unspoken, sat the knowledge of whatever those tapes contained, held over each household like a hand hovering above a chessboard, ready to move. Domestic habits, Hamish thought, turning the labeled reels over in gloved hands, were rarely as innocent as they looked, and a woman who knew the precise rhythm of 4 separate households, who came, who went, what was said behind closed doors when the birds sang loud enough to cover the click of a recording switch, was a woman who had made herself, quite deliberately, the quiet center of every secret in Ardnaglass. The system, he thought, though he'd not yet have called it that in words, was not one of accident or coincidence. Somebody in this village had built, patiently, over years, a private archive of everybody's worst moments and had used the fruits of it to buy herself the reputation of a saint. The break came, as such things often do, from an entirely different direction. 3 days later, when Morag Kessock's classroom was broken into overnight, and the school's petty cash box, holding perhaps £40, was taken along with, more strangely, every one of the children's exercise books from the top shelf of the cupboard. Sergeant McGregor was inclined to call it unconnected. Village boys after easy money, the exercise books taken by mistake in the dark, or for firelighting. But Hamish, standing in the ransacked classroom with the cold morning light coming grey through the windows, thought differently, because the intruder had not touched the till itself, sitting in plain view on Morag's desk with considerably more than £40 in it, and had instead gone straight and precise to the cupboard, where a single locked drawer, which Morag admitted with visible reluctance, held her own private correspondence rather than any school property, had been forced open and searched. "What's kept in there, Morag?" "Letters," she said, very low. "Personal letters. Nothing to do with the murder. Then you'll no mind me having a look. She minded a great deal, Hamish could see. But she opened what remained of the drawer's contents to him anyway, because refusing outright would have looked worse than complying, and among the ordinary correspondence of an ordinary life, bills, a letter from a sister in Perth, school board circulars, there was a gap where something had plainly, recently been removed. An indent in the paper beneath, the faint ghost shape of an envelope that had lain there long enough to leave its mark. Somebody's taken something out of here, Hamish said. Morag's composure, held so carefully through a week of questioning, cracked at last, not into tears but into a flat, exhausted honesty that seemed almost a relief to her. Fenella had a way of keeping things, she said. Letters, notes, we scraps folk let slip in confidence. I dinna ken what she did with them all, but she kept a copy of something of mine, aye, something from years back, and she let me know she had it. No cruel, mind, never cruel about it, just a reminder, now and again, that it existed, and now it's gone missing from your own drawer. Aye. Morag looked at him very steadily. Which means whoever broke in here last night was nae after £40 in a cash box, Hamish. They were after whatever Fenella had already given back to me, or whatever I'd taken from her, and they didn't find it, because I burned it the day after she died. This was, Hamish understood at once, both a confession of sorts and a challenge, Morag admitting to destroying evidence while daring him to prove it had ever mattered, and it changed entirely the shape of the theory Blair had been so satisfied with. The break-in was not the work of village boys chasing coin. It was the work of somebody who knew, or feared, that Fenella's private archive had not died with her, and who was searching, with increasing desperation, for whatever pieces of it remained scattered through the village. It was standing in the byre again, 3 days on, with the birds still eerily silent, despite the vet from Dingwall pronouncing them physically sound in every respect, that Hamish finally understood the how of it, if not yet the who. He'd gone back over the timeline careful, the way he did when a case wouldn't sit right in his head, and it struck him properly for the first time that the 2-day gap Morag had mentioned, tea together on Sunday evening, death discovered Tuesday morning, was not, in fact, a gap at all once you looked closer at Dr. Farquhar's own quiet estimate of time of death, offered almost reluctantly under careful questioning, not Tuesday morning, as the frost and the discovery had suggested, but likely late Sunday night, perhaps even during or shortly after that very tea the two women had shared, which meant Fenella Strachan had been lying dead in her byre, undiscovered, for the better part of 36 hours, in cold enough weather to disguise the timing from a casual glance, and that whoever had struck the fatal blow had had a full day and more, uninterrupted, to arrange the scene exactly as they wished it found, time enough to plant a false tape, cut with surgical precision, in a birdbath position to draw every eye, time enough to move a bell from an eagle's leg to a scarecrow's neck, tied in that strange small noose of red wool. A gesture Hamish now understood not as a clue left carelessly, but as a message, deliberate and coded, meant for someone specific who would understand its meaning even if the police never did. Time enough even to explain the bird's unnatural, lingering silence, not fright at a single sudden noise, but the settled, traumatized hush of creatures who had witnessed, over hours rather than seconds, something violent and prolonged in the space they lived in, and had simply never recovered their voices after. The crime, Hamish now saw, had not been a single frenzied blow struck in panic and covered hastily after. It had been struck Sunday night, and then, over the whole of Monday, meticulously staged, the scene arranged, the false trail of the tape laid with care, the message of the bell tied with a steady enough hand to manage a delicate knot, by somebody who had needed, badly, that extra day of privacy to construct not just an alibi, but an entire alternative story for the police to chase, that ruled out, at a stroke, anybody whose Monday could be accounted for hour by hour in the sight of others, which ruled out Roddy Sinclair entirely, loading his van in full view of his wife and the postie both that day, and left Hamish with a much shorter, much colder list. Whoever had had a full, private, unaccountable day inside or near Corey House, between a Sunday tea and a Tuesday discovery, to turn a single desperate act into the appearance of an elaborate, motiveless mystery. Hamish told nobody what he'd worked out. Not Blair, who'd only have tried to arrest somebody on the strength of a theory not yet proven, and not the villagers, whose fear, he judged, would do more good simmering than settled. He let it be known, instead, in the vague, unhurried way news traveled in Ardnaglass, that the police believed the tape found in the bird bath to be genuine and central to the case, and that an arrest of Roddy Sinclair was expected imminently. A piece of misdirection that cost him nothing, since Blair was busy building exactly that case regardless, and which had the useful effect of making whoever had truly staged the scene believe their construction had succeeded. He watched, in the days that followed, how each of his remaining suspects carried this false relief. Fergus told me seemed genuinely to relax, his unsteady hands settling, his gruff manner easing into something almost cheerful. The reaction, Hamish judged, of a man with a private grudge and nothing worse on his conscience, relieved simply that suspicion had drifted elsewhere. Dr. Farquhar remained exactly as careful as she had been from the first day, neither more nor less, which told Hamish only that whatever she was guarding, she guarded it as a matter of habit rather than fresh panic. But Morag Keswick did not relax at all. If anything, the false news of Roddy's coming arrest seemed to deepen the strain in her, rather than ease it, and Hamish, watching her across the width of the village hall at a hastily called meeting about reassuring the community, saw her eyes go, again and again, to the door, as though watching for someone who had not yet arrived, and whom she was, with every appearance in the room, dreading. It was Ewan, he understood then, the boy who was away at his studies and had not come home even for his mother's evident distress, even for a murder investigation touching his own village and his own mother's closest friend, was somehow the axis on which Morag's whole fear turned, and Hamish began, quietly, without telling a soul, to make inquiries of his own about where exactly the lad had been these past weeks, and why a boy so clever and so promising had not set foot in Ardnaglass since before the murder at all. He held this knowledge close, the way you'd hold a coal you didn't want to burn your hand on but couldn't yet set down, and let the village believe its false relief a while longer, because a settled village, wrongly settled, would show him far more than a frightened one, and because he had learned, over long years of quiet Highland policing, that the surest way to catch the truth was very often to let a lie run just long enough to trip over its own feet. The bell explained itself, in the end, over a cup of tea, with old Fergus told me, in a manner so ordinary that Hamish nearly missed its significance entirely. "Aye, the wee bells," Fergus said, apropos of nothing much, reminiscing about his own boyhood on the point. "My father kept doos, pigeons ye ken, and he'd tie a scrap of red thread round the leg of any bird he meant to give away, so he'd no muddle it with the ones he was keeping. A kind of marking, red for away, plain for staying put. Everybody up and down this coast did the same, in the old days." Hamish set down his cup very carefully. Red for away. The bell moved from the eagle's leg to the scarecrow's neck, tied with a strand of red wool. Not a random cruelty, not mere theatre for the police, but a message in the old country shorthand, a marking meant to say, to whoever in the village still remembered the custom, that something, or someone, was being sent away, removed, released from where it had been kept. He thought at once of Ewan Keswick, away at his studies, and felt the coal in his hand grow suddenly much hotter. He went that same afternoon to the Breaky Academy, where the school records showed, with a plainness that made his stomach drop, that Ewan Keswick had not in fact been attending his studies at all for the better part of 6 weeks, having been quietly withdrawn by his mother on grounds of a family matter, with no further explanation offered or sought. 6 weeks. Long enough, Hamish thought grimly, for a boy of 16 to have been hidden away somewhere entirely, kept out of sight of a village that would otherwise have asked questions, and the red thread on the scarecrow's bell tied the very day the scene was staged, now read to him not as cruelty toward a dead woman's beloved eagle, but as a private, desperate message from mother to son, or perhaps from Fenella herself, recorded in the very last gesture of the staged scene. He is away. He is sent away. He is safe, for now, from what is coming. It fit, too, with the tape's too clean recording of Roddy Sinclair's old, out-of-context threat, a diversion built by somebody who had needed the village's suspicion to land anywhere at all, except on a 16-year-old boy, and the mother desperately trying to protect him. And Hamish understood, with the particular cold clarity that came to him only rarely, and only when a case was truly about to break open, that he was no longer looking for a killer motivated by greed, or old grudge, or cold calculation. He was looking for a mother, and a secret so heavy that a woman gentle enough to teach a village's children their sums had been driven, on some black Sunday night, to strike a blow she had likely never in her whole life imagined herself capable of. Hamish did not confront Morag directly. He had learned, over years of watching frightened people, that a direct accusation only hardens a person's resolve to lie, whereas the right piece of bait, dropped quiet and sideways, will often do a frightened person's own conscience the courtesy of doing his work for him. He called, instead, a small gathering at the village hall, ostensibly to update the community on the investigation's progress, a courtesy the Strathbane lot rarely bothered with, but which Hamish, as the local man, felt he owed his neighbours, and he made sure, in the course of his remarks, to mention, in the mildest possible tone, that the tape recovered from the birdbath had in fact now been fully analyzed and dated by the Inverness laboratory, and that alongside the recording of Mr. Sinclair, several other tapes had also been recovered from Mrs. Strachan's private study concerning various households in the village, and that these too would shortly be reviewed as part of the ongoing inquiry. It was not strictly a lie. The tapes had indeed been recovered, and would indeed be reviewed, but Hamish let the sentence hang with rather more weight and rather more imminence than the truth entirely supported, and watched, from beneath lowered lashes, exactly who in the small crowded hall went very still at the words. Morag Kessock's teacup did not shake. Her face did not change, but her hand, resting on her knee, closed slowly into a fist, and her eyes went once more to the door, and Hamish thought, watching her, that here was a woman holding herself together with a discipline that must have cost her every scrap of strength she had. He did one thing more before the meeting broke up that he had debated with himself a long while over the rightness of doing. He mentioned in passing, as though it were merely an administrative detail, that any young person who might have information relevant to the inquiry, however indirect, ought to come forward soon, as the investigation was moving toward its conclusion, and that delay, at this stage, would serve no one's interests, least of all their own. It was aimed, and Morag knew it was aimed, and Hamish watched something in her face crumple very slightly, just at the corners, before she mastered it again. He walked home that night, with Bran trotting silent at his heel, and felt none of the satisfaction a younger, harder policeman might have felt at successfully baiting a suspect into panic. He felt instead the particular weariness that came, in cases like this, from knowing that whatever happened next would very likely break something in a family that had, until a fortnight past, been simply a quiet mother and a clever, promising son, going about their ordinary Highland lives. But a woman was dead, struck down in her own byre among her silenced birds, and whatever tragedy lay behind that violence, it could not be left unspoken merely because the truth, once spoken, would hurt. The panic, when it came not from Morag at all, but from Ewan. Hamish had set MacGregor, discreetly, to watch the road into Ardnaglass that night, on the theory that a boy hidden away for 6 weeks, hearing second-hand of tapes about to be reviewed, and an investigation moving toward its conclusion, might do something rash rather than sit passively waiting to be found. And shortly after midnight, MacGregor's radio crackled with word of a young man on a bicycle, moving fast and without lights along the shore road toward Corrie House. Hamish reached the cottage himself within minutes, on foot across the fields with Bran loping silent beside him, and found Ewan Keswick already inside the dark study, the locked cabinet, resealed since the search, but with a key Ewan plainly possessed or had taken from his mother, standing open, the boy's hands full of the remaining labeled tapes, his whole body shaking with the particular violent tremor of someone who has been holding terror in check for weeks and has finally run out of strength to do it. "I only wanted to find mine," Ewan said, before Hamish had said a word, the confession spilling out of him with the force of a held breath finally released. "She kept one on me too, on both of us, Ma'am and me, and I thought, if I could just find it and burn it, none of this need come out, none of it, and Ma'am would nae have to—" He stopped himself, but not soon enough. "Would nae have to what, son?" Ewan's face, in the thin torchlight, was the face of a boy far younger than 16, stripped suddenly of every pretense of composure. "It was nae meant to happen," he said. "None of it was meant to happen. Ma'am only went to ask her, one more time, to leave us be, that's all, just to ask, the way she'd asked a dozen times before. And Fenella said the same thing she always said, that she'd nothing personal against us, that she'd simply keep what she kept, and use it if she ever had need. And Ma'am," he couldn't finish it. He didn't need to. Hamish crossed the small dark room and took the tapes gently from the boy's shaking hands, and did not, in that moment, reach for handcuffs or caution, but simply sat him down at Fenella's own desk and said, quietly, "I think it's time we went and found your mother, son, and let her tell it in her own words, in her own time, before this gets any further out of hand than it already has." Morag Kessock was waiting for them when they reached the schoolhouse cottage, sitting very upright at her kitchen table in the lamplight, as though she had known, the moment Ewan slipped out into the dark, exactly where the night would end. She did not resist, and she did not, when Hamish came through her door with her son beside him, ask what Ewan had said, or try to shape her own account around it. She only looked at Hamish with an exhausted, almost grateful steadiness, the look of someone finally set down a weight she had carried alone far past the point of bearing it, and said, "I suppose you'll be wanting the whole of it then." Hamish, mindful of procedure even in a moment so heavy with human sorrow, cautioned her properly, and asked whether she wished a solicitor present before saying anything further, and Morag shook her head, very slight, and said she'd tell it now, while she still had the courage, because courage, she said, was a thing she had precious little practice at, and did not trust herself to summon twice. There was no drama to the arrest itself, no chase, no struggle, no raised voice in the small, cold kitchen. Hamish simply sat across the table from her, with Ewan white-faced and silent at his mother's shoulder, and let her speak, taking down what she said as gently and as plainly as he could, while outside the frost settled again over Ardnaglass, and the loch lay black and still under a sky gone hard with stars. It was, Hamish thought, watching her, the quietest catch he had ever made in all his years wearing the uniform. No triumph in it at all, only the flat, grey relief of a thing ended before it could do further damage, and the much larger, much heavier question still to come of what exactly had driven a gentle schoolteacher, in one terrible, unplanned moment on a Sunday night, to strike a blow she would carry, now, for the whole remainder of her life. He thought, too, briefly, of the birds in their silent cages back at Corrie House, and understood at last, with a sadness he hadn't expected, that they had not gone quiet from any single fright at all, but from the same thing that had silenced everyone in this story sooner or later, the long, grinding weight of secrets kept too well, for too long, until something in the keeping of them finally broke. Hamish laid it all out for Blair 2 days later, in the Bricky station, with a patience he did not entirely feel, because Blair's satisfaction in his own wrong theory had, if anything, hardened rather than softened in the face of contrary evidence, and it took the better part of an hour, and Morag's own signed statement besides, to walk him through the true shape of the thing. Fenella Strachan, for all her reputation as the gentle birdsong lady of Ardnaglass, had spent years quietly gathering, through hidden microphones disguised among her nesting boxes and recording equipment, the private conversations of at least 4 households in the village, Roddy Sinclair's debts and his temper, Dr. Farquhar's own guarded professional secrets, old Fergus Tolmie's long-buried resentments, and, most damagingly of all, a confession made years before by Morag Kesson in the privacy of her own kitchen concerning the true and rather more troubling circumstances of Ewan's parentage, a fact that, revealed publicly in a small, tight-knit Highland community, would have shattered both mother's and son's place in the only home either of them had ever known. Fenella had never demanded money outright, which was precisely why nobody in the village had ever suspected her. She had instead offered gifts, generous and apparently freely given, the roof fund, the school books, the quiet forgiveness of debts, and had let each recipient understand, gently but unmistakably, that these gifts came paired with her continued, private discretion, a discretion that could, at any time she chose, be withdrawn. On the Sunday night in question, Morag had gone to Corey House, meaning only to ask, one final time, whether Fenella might destroy the recording concerning Ewan now that the boy was old enough to be badly hurt by its exposure, and Fenella, tired perhaps, or simply unwilling to relinquish the quiet power she'd built for herself over a decade, had refused with a coldness Morag had never before seen in her, saying that she kept such things for her own security and saw no reason to give up that security merely because a mother found it inconvenient. The blow, when it came, had come in a single moment of desperate, unplanned rage, Morag reaching for the nearest heavy object, a bronze birdbath ornament, and striking once, without premeditation, before her own horror at what she'd done overtook her entirely. It was only afterward, through the long, terrible hours of Monday, alone with the body and her own unraveling panic, that Morag, clever, careful, a schoolteacher's mind if ever there was one, had constructed the false trail, retrieving one of Fenella's own old tapes of Roddy Sinclair's out-of-context threat and staging it in the birdbath to misdirect suspicion, and marking the eagle's bell with red wool in the old country code her own grandmother had taught her, as a last desperate, half-conscious signal meant only for herself, a private acknowledgement that her son must now be sent away, hidden, kept safe from whatever came next. The bird's long silence, Hamish said quietly, closing his notebook, was simply what happened to any creature, feathered or otherwise, that spent a full day and night confined with violence and grief, and had not yet found its voice again. There remained, even with the truth of the killing established, the smaller tangle of lies each villager had told, and Hamish took some care, in the days that followed, to see them properly unpicked, because a small community does not heal simply from knowing who struck the blow. It needs, too, to understand which of its everyday shabby secrets were never truly connected to the murder at all, and can therefore, at last, be set down. Roddy Sinclair's threat on the tape, recorded months before the murder and never repeated, was exactly what it had first appeared, and nothing more. The ordinary bitter words of a desperate man, in a moment of temper, seized upon by Morag only because it existed, ready-made, on one of Fenella's own old reels, ripe for misdirection. Roddy's debt to Fenella, Hamish confirmed with the bank in Brakey, had in fact been largely forgiven in her will, a final quiet generosity that sat uneasily now beside everything else that had come to light about her, but which was, Hamish thought, no less real for its complications. Dr. Farquhar's careful reticence, it emerged under gentle questioning, concerned nothing more sinister than an old professional indiscretion from her training years, a matter Fenella had known of and never once threatened to use, though the mere knowledge of it had been enough to keep the doctor's guard permanently raised around the older woman, a caution that had, in the end, told Hamish nothing about the murder and a good deal about the quiet, corrosive effect Fenella's private archive had had on the whole village's ease with itself. Fergus Tolmie's unsteady hands and gruff dismissal of Fenella turned out to be rooted in an old, almost comically minor grievance, a boundary dispute over a stretch of shoreline decades past that had curdled over years of solitary brooding into a dislike far larger than its cause, and which had nothing whatsoever to do with murder beyond making Fergus, for a week, look rather more suspicious than an old man's crotchety temper deserved. And the break-in at the schoolhouse, which Hamish confirmed gently with Morag in one of his final visits before her transfer to remand, had indeed been her own doing. A desperate, badly executed attempt in the days after the killing to retrieve and destroy the last physical trace of the secret that had driven her to violence, disguised clumsily as an ordinary theft to avoid drawing attention to what she was truly searching for. Each thread, once pulled loose and examined in the plain light of day, proved to be exactly as small and human and separate from the murder as Hamish had suspected from the start. The ordinary, shabby, private business of an ordinary village, none of it deserving the weight Blair's tidy theory had briefly tried to hang upon it. There was no triumph in Hamish Macbeth on the day Morag Keswick was formally charged, and driven away from Ardnaglass in the back of a police car, with her son standing white and silent at the schoolhouse gate, watching her go. He thought, more than once in the weeks that followed, of the peculiar shape of the tragedy. A woman who had, by every visible measure, been the gentlest presence in the village, teaching its children with patience and care for 2 decades, driven in a single unplanned moment to violence by a threat that had, in truth, been building quietly against her and her son for years, one small forgiven debt and one funded set of schoolbooks at a time, until the weight of it simply became more than she could carry a moment longer. He thought too of Fenella Strachan, and found he could not, in honesty, hold her entirely to the saintly image the village had built of her, nor entirely to the cold blackmailer Blair's own later theory tried to paint her as. She had been, Hamish concluded, something messier and more human than either. A woman who perhaps had genuinely loved the village she'd settled in, who gave freely and often from real feeling, and who had also, somewhere along the way, discovered in herself a taste for the quiet power that comes from knowing what others feared to have known, and had let that taste grow, slowly, unchecked, until it had become the defining shape of her final years, and, in the end, the cause of her death. There was no clean villain in it, and no clean victim either. Only 2 women, each carrying a private history they had never fully shared with the village that thought it knew them both so well, and a boy caught between them whose whole future had been shaped, without his knowledge or consent, by a single old secret and a single desperate act. The legal reckoning, when it came, would be for others to decide. The courts in Inverness, the lawyers, the careful weighing of provocation against premeditation that Morag's staging of the false evidence would complicate considerably in her defense. But the moral reckoning, Hamish thought, walking the shore road alone one grey evening, with Bran at his heel and the loch lying flat and silent under low cloud, was a good deal simpler and a good deal sadder than any court could properly capture. That secrets, kept too carefully for too long by too many people in too small a place, will very often come due all at once, and the bill, when it finally arrives, rarely falls on the person who deserves it most. By the time the first proper snow came to Ardnaglass, the byre at Curry House had been sold on, the 40 cages emptied and the birds released or rehomed with a sanctuary near Ullapool, all save the young golden eagle, which Hamish himself had driven, with some ceremony, to the raptor centre outside Dingwall, where it was pronounced fit at last, months on, to be released back to the hills it had come from. He went to see it go, on a bright cold morning, with frost still silvering the heather, and watched it lift off from the handler's glove in one long slow beat of wing, circling once high over the glen before it caught a thermal and was gone, small and dark against a sky gone suddenly, achingly blue. Ardnaglass itself had settled, the way villages do, into a new and slightly quieter version of its old rhythms. Roddy Sinclair's shop, trading on much as before, the debt that had once hung over him now simply a fact of the past rather than a live shame. Dr. Farquhar, a fraction less guarded in her manner, as though some private tension had gone out of her along with Fenella's. Old Fergus Ptolemy, grumbling about the same old boundary dispute to anyone who'd listen, apparently unbothered that the whole village now knew the pettiness of its origins. Ewan Kessock had gone to stay with an aunt near Inverness, and wrote, Hamish heard, careful, dutiful letters to his mother on remand, and there was talk, though nothing settled yet, of the boy returning to his studies come the new term, older by a great deal more than the months that had actually passed. Hamish himself thought often, in the quiet hours of his rounds, of the birds sitting silent in their cages that first frosted morning, and of how long it had taken them, even after the immediate danger passed, to find their voices again, weeks in most cases, before the sanctuary reported them singing properly, tentatively, as if testing whether the world had truly gone safe once more. It seemed to him, walking the shore road in the blue Highland dusk, with Bran trotting companionably at his heel, that villages were not so very different from birds in a byre, that they too could be struck silent by a violence they hadn't caused and didn't fully understand, and that the return of ordinary noise, ordinary gossip, ordinary small quarrels over shop debts and shoreline boundaries was itself a kind of healing, however imperfect, however slow. He did not think Ardnaglass would forget Fenella Strachan, nor what she had truly been beneath the gentle reputation she'd cultivated so carefully for so long. But he thought, too, watching the last of the day's light fade gold over Bienfeur, that the village would sing again in its own time, the way the birds had, quietly, tentatively, and then, at last, as though nothing had ever silenced it at all,